How to use smart objects in Photoshop. I'm using CC220, you could use 219, 218, etc. The key panel for this tutorial is the Layers panel. Go to the Layers panel and you can see the background layer. Obviously I don't want to work with a white background, so I'm going to add something. I'm just going to add a basic gradient. I'm going to use the gradient tool, quickly add some gradients, and using the blending mode of difference. You could easily use an open document. Well, I'm going to turn that into a smart object. Go to the Layer menu, go to the Smart Objects, and convert to Smart Object. The background layer is now a smart object. Once converted to a smart object, you can't access the layer directly. When I hover over the document, you can see it's locked. You can't directly apply brushstrokes. You can edit it by double-clicking the little smart object thumbnail in the Layers panel. So the design can be changed at a later point. You can now apply smart filters and adjustments which are editable at any point. You can also add layer styles, etc., which can be edited at any point as well. You can also convert type into a smart object. You can convert 3D models into a smart object. You can also create custom shapes, designs, and turn them into a smart object. You can also place objects and convert those into smart objects as well. I'm applying the shape as a shape layer. You can see that in the top left. To convert into a smart object, go to the Layer menu, go down to Smart Objects and convert to Smart Object. As a smart object, you can go to the Filter menu and add smart filters, which you can edit at any point. You can also add adjustments as well as styles. If you go to the Layers panel, you can see that little smart object thumbnail there. You can use the design in timelines, so you can modify that. You can also add transformations. I'm just going back to the basic document. I'm going to select part of the design. I'm going to use the elliptical marquee tool and use Ctrl-C, Ctrl-V to copy and paste. I'm using the elliptical marquee tool, but you could use any other selection tools, maybe select areas using the lasso tool. The key thing is I want a layer. I want something to work with, so I want to turn that into a smart object. So I'm going to create, like I say, a selection and use that as a layer. The key panel throughout this tutorial is the Layers panel. It's all using layers into smart objects. You can now see the new layer in the Layers panel. At the moment, it's just a standard layer. I can move it around, I can scale it, rotate it, edit it in a number of ways. However, it's best not to scale it before you turn it into a smart object. Use the biggest design possible. You can also add effects, adjustments, etc. to that design. I'm going to turn it into a smart object, Layer menu and Smart Objects, and convert to Smart Object. It's been converted. You can't apply brushes, etc. unless you go back to the edit point. Go over to the Layers panel and you can again see that smart object thumbnail. You can apply effects, layer styles, etc. and they're all editable at any point. You can also apply transformations, so you can scale it, warp it, etc. You can create multiple copies of it by holding down the Alt or Option key with the Move tool and dragging. You now have multiple entries. They're all the same smart object. You can select all of those smart objects and they can all be converted into a single smart object. The smart object can include multiple smart objects, type, 3D, custom shapes, etc. Go to Layer menu and Smart Objects, convert to Smart Object. It's a single smart object. You can see the smart object thumbnail. You can double click the smart object thumbnail to edit the design. The 4 objects can be moved, transformed, etc. Hold down the Alt or Option key and drag and duplicate the smart object. You can fill the entire document with this design. You can of course also add transformations such as warp, rotations. By using the bounding box to rotate it, you can continue to duplicate by holding down the Alt or Option key. For each of those smart objects, you can go to the Image menu and Adjustments, add Vibrance, etc. You can also go to the Filter menu, add Liquify, etc. All those effects can be edited at any point. You can select all those smart objects, yet another group of smart objects. You can keep doing this, keep repeating smart object groupings. Not sure if there is a limit to this. the editing just gets slower and slower as you add more and more of these items. You can resize the smart object. Again, with all those designs, what you can do, go to the Layer menu, Smart Objects, and convert to Smart Object. A single smart object again. Now this smart object is made of a gradient, but it could be a video, etc. Again, hold down the Alt Option key and drag to duplicate that design. Fill the entire document with your smart objects. And they're all still editable. You could fill the document using the Edit menu and fill. Maybe you use patterns, random scripts, etc. But one issue with that is you can't edit the individual parts at a later stage. In a standard fill, all the objects are frozen. With smart objects, it's editable at any point. I'm certain there are some limits with smart objects, but I must admit I haven't found any. If there are any, always add them in the comments maybe. Now I can duplicate that, I've just resized it, and then just continue to create multiple copies. Now you can select any of those, like that one, and you can move that around. You can also go to Layer menu and Layer Style and Bevel Emboss, so you can add a bevel just to that design. None of the others are touched. So when you apply the style, it's only to that smart object. The underlying design for the smart object is still unchanged. You can add a drop shadow, as well as a color overlay, pattern overlay, gradient, etc. They're all editable. You can see that in the Layers panel. You can also remove them. Go to another smart object. With that smart object, go to the Image menu and Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and change the colour slightly. Click OK. You can also go to the Filter menu with the selected smart object and go to maybe Blur. You can add your Gaussian blur, but you will notice that some filters, such as the lens blur, are not available for smart filters. Some filters also don't particularly work very well with smart objects. Via the Layers panel, you can edit that effect at any point. You can also apply transformations to it. So go to Edit menu, Transform and Warp, or use the Rotate and Distort. You can distort the smart object and the underlying design is still unchanged. During all these edits, that gradient you created and copied and pasted is still there and can still be changed later. If at any later stage you go back to the Edit menu and Transform and Warp, you will notice the warp is still available to be edited, so you can distort it even more. Or maybe remove some of the warp, up to you. A smart object has only one warp. You can also again hold down the Alt Option key and drag to create multiple copies of that smart object. You can go to any of the other smart objects and add additional transformations, warps, etc. They can all be unique. If you want to change the underlying design, well, you can go back to the smart object, double click on the entry. You can select any of the smart objects. They're all the same smart objects. Just double click on the smart object to edit it. You can repeat double clicking the smart objects in each of the documents to go back to the source design. Avoid going over the edge. Don't move the object so it goes outside of the document. Keep it within the document. And then edit it in all kinds of ways. You can apply filters. You can recolor it. You can also duplicate the design, make multiple copies. You can also add additional shapes. You can also apply brush strokes. Go to the Filter menu, go to Distort and Wave. You could also use Liquify, etc. Gallery effects, oil paint, etc. I'm not going to use the default. I never liked the default of Wave, so just manipulate the values. I'm going to change the wavelength, amplitude, etc. Just go through the settings just to distort it slightly, but you could of course use, as mentioned, you could use Liquify or maybe use the Edit and Transform and Warp. But I think Wave is quite useful. Once you're happy with your wave design, click OK. You've got your waved design. You can now hold down the Alt Option key and duplicate that. You can move it around, maybe rotate it, perhaps use other transformations, perhaps go and use liquefy. You can also add other shapes, custom shapes, circles, rectangles, stars, etc. Or use a different gradient. You could also recolor it slightly by using the image menu, adjustments and hue and saturation. Once you've changed it, click OK. Layer menu, and you can go and add some stars to it. So layer menu. And now this isn't a smart object. This design is not the smart object. This is the source all the way back through the smart objects. You can add a drop shadow to it, or maybe a color overlay or gradient overlay or pattern overlay. Maybe use a blending mode as well. Use a blending mode to change the color in many different ways. So all again, these are editable as well. Of course, you can go back to change the star. You can see there in the layers panel, all the stars are still available. Once you've done that, you can close the document as you would any. It's not a real document, it's an internal document. You can, of course, save it via the usual means. When closing, click Save and do this all the way back to obviously the final result. Close that document and again, save it. You can see all the different layers there. Close that and click Save. So once you've closed everything, go all the way back to the final document. Everything will now be updated with those changes to the design. It might take a few seconds to process each time. Depends how Photoshop's feeling that day, how quick your machine is, and how complex. Instead of a single object now, you've got two objects in each of those custom shapes, and that reflects in the final design. Includes all the bevels, etc. You can then continue to work on the design. Using the Move tool, hold down the Alt or Option key and drag to duplicate the design. Repeat that to fill the entire document with your design. You can then go to the Edit menu and transform and maybe apply a warp or distort, etc. A variety of transformations are available. The underlying source document is still available, so you can always edit it and create thousands and thousands of amazing background designs using this approach. Of course, a vast number of other designs can be created. Smart objects are a real flexible, wonderful feature of Photoshop. You can also copy them into your CC library via the window menu and libraries. You can also flatten the entire document, removing the smart objects, but you can also go to File menu and save it as a PSD document. You can then reopen the PSD document and all the smart objects will still be available and still be editable. I could continue, keep adding more and more smart objects, continue to modify them, layer them even more. But obviously, there's got to be a certain endpoint. You can use smart objects with animation, you can use smart objects with 3D, and much, much more. Hope you found this tutorial about smart objects of interest. Please subscribe to the Graphicxtras channel, always adding new tutorials about Photoshop, Illustrator and many others. Please add some comments, always appreciated, a dislike or like. Thank you much.